we're going to introduce Amy. Amy Thompson is here and is a licensed clinical social worker and super expertive at, is that a word? You're super smart at how brains develop and how that affects behavior, and as parents, how we can get some of that inside information to kind of strategize for raising our kids. And she's awesome at her job.
So we're going to work from Dr. Dan Siegel's book, Brainstorm. So I've been a Dr. Dan Siegel fan for years. He does this great work around interpersonal neurobiology, and I love it. But when he wrote this book about the teenage brain, I don't even think I had a teenager quite yet. Maybe he was right there at the beginning. I was like, oh, this might be helpful for me. And so it's one of those books that once I picked it up, I could not put it down because it had so much good stuff. And in the time, I was a practicing therapist, and so I had teenagers in my office every day, and so it just made sense to me. And once I began to share it with parents are like, this makes more sense, like I can do this. And so it just became important for me just to be able to share this kind of information. I do this a lot with preschool children and their parents and the teachers, but I don't get to do this a lot with teenage parents anymore because I quit doing therapy. So I'm excited to be with you guys tonight, and it was fun to get back into some of this. So I start with parenting is hard work. I joke about, you go to IKEA and you get furniture and you have to get the instruction manual out just to put it together, but you all left a hospital with this infant in this carrier and no one gave you instructions unless you bought the million books that are out there, and then you don't even read some of those books. And at a certain point, we quit reading those books, and I think in the teenagers is when we need them the most. And so that was another reason why I'm excited about this book, because I think it gives good information. Here's how I define the teenage years, and honestly, for Dan Siegel's work around adolescence, he talks about age 12 to 24. So I want you to hear me say that, because sometimes we think when they get to a certain age, this is great, but the brain is still developing, and so it's important for us when we're frustrated with their 22 and 23-year-olds, their brain is still developing. But what I think is important for us to think about is why parenting is hard work for teenagers is it's so emotionally challenging because they're emotional and we're getting emotional reactivity in line with that. When they throw the emotions at us, we often are throwing emotions back at them, and then we wonder why things are blowing up. And so I think it's this balancing act that, again, if we know more about our brains and their brains, that is helpful. The other piece I think that happens during the adolescence, these teenagers, is we're wanting to give space because we want them to grow and develop, but we're also not wanting to give space because we want to keep them safe. We want to make sure they're making good decisions. And so that's the balancing act, is how much space do I give? How much do I not give? And that then feeds into the brain development. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go. And the last thing that I honestly think our goal should be, which again is hard, and I think this has been my goal as a parent, and I was just saying he's graduating in May, and there's days I think I did this really well, and there's days I'm like, I messed this up. But the goal for me has been providing structure with empowerment. So think about that for a second. Like, how have I given structure and created some boundaries and balance and all of those pieces, but also created this environment of empowerment so that I have a child that's leaving my house that can make decisions, that does not have to follow the crowd, that can look at a situation and analyze it and problem solve it. And so when I think about the word structure and empowerment, like that is really probably the goal of parenting a teenager, is how do we give enough structure to help keep them safe, but also how do I empower them? And again, I think a lot of this brain information tonight is going to give you the answers to how do I provide structure or structure and empowerment. So this is the premise, and we have to start here so that the rest makes sense. But so Dan Siegel years ago created the hand model of the brain and kind of labeled it flipping your lid. So when we begin to understand the basics of the brain, then I'm going to add in what's happening in the adolescent brain. So I like this too because your hand goes everywhere with you. So in those moments when things are falling apart, I hope that you'll just look at your hand and be like, okay, what is happening right now? So we're going to start with the downstairs brain. So the downstairs brain, so we're going to start with your wrist here. So your spinal cord comes up into your brainstem and into this area. I should also say, like, this is dumbed down. So if any of you are biology people, like, this is so that all of us lay people can understand what's happening in our brains. So the spinal cord sends information from our body to our brain. It's coming up into our brainstem. And so in this region is our brainstem. And then we have our finger folded over, which we like to call the limbic region, which is where the hippocampus and the amygdala live. This is the emotional reactivity zone. And this is important for us to know. Whether we are a child that is 6 years old, or we are a teenager that's 15, or you are 45 years old, this region gets worked a lot for all of us. Because situations, experiences happen, they're out here in front of us, it's happening in front of me, it comes in, my brain is taking in this information and processing it in a split second. And this region houses past experiences, the emotions, and all of those pieces, and it's just sorting and dividing, reading, accessing all the information of previous experiences. And as that comes in, it determines whether I stay in this downstairs region, or my fingers come down and my cortex, which is the thinking part of our brain, gets activated. Now, when the thinking part of your brain gets activated, we are all able to do what we call basic executive function skills. So, goal setting, goal achievement, task initiation, time management, impulse control, empathy, all of these things live in the thinking part of our brain, so this cortex region. When my lid is flipped, I no longer have access to those executive function skills because the hippocampus, the amygdala, all of that is in reactive mode. When your brain is in reactive mode, doesn't matter how old you are, your skill sets are going to be stomping your feet, crying, throwing a fit, yelling, screaming, saying mean things. And even your fight, flight, or freeze response gets activated. So you may be fighting, you may be running, or you may just be frozen in place. These are the skills that are available when we have flipped our lids and the downstairs of our brain is at work. So think about yourselves, think about your kids, your teenagers. Like, this is where we spend a lot of time. We do. This, the cortex, the thinking part of our brain, is when we're at our best. But we have, again, limited access to that, but also bursts of access to that. Like, I can't be the most organized, task-initiating, goal-achieving person. Like, I cannot do that for 8 hours every day. None of us can do that. Now, can I be really task-focused for 20 minutes? You bet. But then something comes up, and I'm like, oh, look at that. And I start reading that, and then I lose track of where I was. Like, that is normal behavior. So that is happening for all of us all the time. Here's what's happening in the teenage brain. This is why you're here. So this is what's happening for all of us, but here's what's happening in the teenage brain. What happens is when something is in front of me and the information is coming in, it's coming in here, but I, as an adult, am processing that information in what we call the slow route. So I'm able to pause, reflect, think about, and my lid hopefully flips down, and I'm able to then work my way through it. The teenage brain is actually wired. They know this from scans and research. It is wired to use the fast route. Would you like to know what the fast route is? Fast route is this. The fast route is it bypasses what we call cortex reasoning and heads straight to the amygdala region, which is all about emotions. So when we think about the things that come at us from our teenagers, oftentimes it feels very emotionally based. And that is because it is. Because their brain goes the fast route, even when they're calm, even when life seems great. It goes the fast route before it takes what we call the slow route, which is the cortical reasoning. Why does it do that? It's how it was designed. It's how it processes. Here's what we need to know about that, though. Is so when they're coming at us with those quick and reactivity, it isn't about really that they're in this big emotional place. It's just about how they processed that last piece of information that came at them. And if we could stay here, if we can stay in our thinking brain, guess what? We can ask questions, we can be reflective with them, and we can work through that. But here's what happens. This happened to me just last week. I make a general statement or question, and I get, well, like I get the attitude. And this is what happened, you guys, seriously. And I start to hear, I can hear it coming out of my mouth, and then I was like, I almost said, don't talk to me like that. I just joined I just joined him in the fast route. But I paused, put my lid back down, and I was like, your voice, so again, I'm using some reflection skills here. Your voice had an edge to it. Your voice had harshness. Your voice had a tone. Share with me again. And that is it, you guys. Now, it doesn't work every time. In that moment, it worked because literally it was the fast route. It wasn't this big emotional blow up. I used a reflection skill with him to help him hear himself because he kind of looked at me and he goes, oh. He goes, I didn't mean to do, he didn't even mean to do that. And in the moment, it was just this. Here's what happened. His head was in his phone. I asked a question, and I know what it was. So I could have joined him there, and then here we are. Both of our lids are flipped. I'm emotionally reactive. He's emotionally reactive, and now we're at war. And nothing gets resolved. Versus if I can pause and think, how am I going to coach through this? Which for me, that was reflection. And that is what I use, a lot of reflection. So that way he can hear himself. He didn't hear it. So here's the other piece that happens for a teenage brain. There becomes imbalance between this downstairs, upstairs, and even right to left. So we haven't even talked about that, but you have a right side and left side to your brain. There becomes imbalance for them because of the level of emotional reactivity that happens and because of peer relationships. We're going to talk about peer relationships. They're so important, but they're also sometimes so influential that we struggle with how to support our teens in those relationships. So we're going to talk about that too. But I just want to lift that up right now. Peer influence and those intense emotions also create imbalance, which gets a lot of that emotional reactivity that we get. Here's my last big brain piece. So in general, all of us, especially as we were growing up in the teenage years, it's part of what the brain is doing, is it creates maps. They call them maps. And so it's when neurons are firing in your brain, it creates patterns, and we call those maps. And those maps get formed based on your experiences. And so the social experiences that we have form maps. And again, those maps come up whenever we have a similar situation. That is happening at a rapid pace throughout the teenage years. And so again, that throws things a little out of balance because taking in so much information and all that mapping is happening. So it's very important because they're going to need that in adulthood. But again, also means that we're going to see some of that emotional reactivity, and we're also going to see the power of the relationships that they have with their peers, because that's obviously what their social maps are about. There's so much I want to tell you about this because this part is so important. The other piece that I probably should lift up too is when we're in our upstairs brain, we like to call that integration because we are in a place where we are able to be responsive and there's harmony and we're able to problem solve, all of those pieces are happening. When we're in our downstairs brain, we are in a space of what we call chaos, rigidity, all of those pieces because the world isn't going our way. And so we are making, everybody's going to know that. And so what happens is the world around us our relationships get impacted, how we see ourselves gets impacted. And that is all part of this integration piece. So that's the other piece why we want to work on this cortical thinking is because it helps us stay integrated. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So I like this image. That's why I brought it. So when you think about this, how do we integrate? We want to have a river. So think about the flow of a river. So sometimes there's big waves and sometimes there's little waves, but the river stays in the banks. That is our goal with some of these exercises, and when I talk about how to maximize certain things tonight, like that's our goal each and every time, is how do I create integration? Like I want to have my upstairs brain activated and working, and I want to make sure that the right and left side of my brain are working together. So the left side tends to be, logical, linear, the language box. The right side tends to be emotions, creativeness, expressiveness, and so we want those two sides to be talking to each other. Most of us know somebody who has really big feelings, but can't ever talk about them. So they're a little more right-brained than they are left-brained. Others can talk, but you never see an emotional expression on their face. So great language skills, but not as in tune with their emotions. What we want to seek is this balance, this integration of right to left, but also the integration of upstairs, downstairs. So integration means I'm in the river, I'm floating the river, there's some big waves, there's some little waves, like this is everyday life. The banks of this river is chaos and rigidity. So chaos is when things are just overwhelming, out of control, and when we hit chaos, we're always going to be in our downstairs brain. And when I hit rigidity, so when I'm controlling, when I'm non-flexible and I am stuck, like it is this way and it's not going to be any other way, I'm in my downstairs brain. So how we come back together to get the integration to float on the river is about reflection. So again, we got to look inward. And the other piece is empathy. So I have to have a lens that allows me to see other people and what they might be experiencing and feeling. So I'm using that word because here's the deal about empathy. We know that children begin to build empathy skills in preschool. We know that there's another round of some development in early elementary. But that full meaning of empathy and being able to really understand, look at, have the lens of what somebody else might be seeing, experiencing, feeling, is in the teenage years. Which I think is sometimes kind of funny because most of us are like, my teenager doesn't understand anybody else but themselves. But that skill is actually still growing and building in them. And the work that we can do with this integration can help. So reflection and empathy skills will help us with the integration to stay on the river. So let's talk about myths. So I found 3 myths that I think are common myths that we think about with teenagers, and I want to dispel these with some brain information. So the first one is this, that raging hormones cause teens to go mad. Does anyone in this room identify with that? You feel like you have a teenager that is just crazy, out of control. You're like, what is going on? Who took my kid? Like, who possessed my child? All right, we got some. Thanks. I know there's more than that one that hand went up. Here's the deal. Hormones do increase during the teenage years because of puberty, but really what we're seeing is that the brain is undergoing remodeling. I also like that too. Like thinking about my brain is getting remodeled gives me a good picture. Like if you've ever remodeled anything in your house, like things get all torn up, things are a mess, things are dusty and dirty, but then when it all gets put back together, it's beautiful. So the same thing is happening with your teenager's brain. So what we are seeing is changes in development, and most of that is around pruning. So I'm not going to get into all the science of pruning because we could be here for days. What I like to talk about pruning is this, is that when they are little, they are collecting so much information in their brain. They're sponges, they're absorbing, and then we hit this wall of we got to get rid of some of that. We don't need all of that. And so part of the teenage years is just that, pruning away the information that I am not using so that I can free up space for the stuff that I am going to use, like the new information that's still coming in. Like if you have a kid that plays a sport, or musical instrument, like you've got to free up space so those things can keep growing. So you got to prune away the pieces that you're not using anymore. That's a big one. And so I think if we can think about that, like they're not going mad or crazy, like their brain is just getting remodeled right now. That pruning is happening right now so that they can make room for what they really want to store in their brains. So myth number 2 is they're immature and they just need to grow up. Well, here's the deal. They are growing up. They are. Their brain is remodeling, and part of that is the developmental process for them growing. And here's the thing. I think when we think about they're just immature and they just need to get through this, just get through it, we're not giving them the opportunity to actually grow and develop. We're like, we just got to survive this. And sometimes that is what the teenage years feel like. What if you changed your perspective and you shifted and thought to yourself, what can I do to teach and coach so that we can move through this together? Very different approach than, oh my God, I just got to get through this next weekend with him. No. I know what's going to happen this weekend. He's not going to want to come home at the curfew time, and he's going to ask for a different curfew time. And so I can either be rigid, or I can already now start talking about it, thinking about it, coaching, having conversation. Those are lifelong skills versus I'm just dealing with the next thing that comes up in this moment. And again, we're tired. I've been to Columbia today and back, and here I am with you. I'm tired. And I got to go home and be a parent still. But here's the deal. I'm still going to make time to teach and coach because I know what that's going to get me on the other side. And then there's going to be nights I'm going to come home and just jack it up because I do. And the next day I'm like, I sure could have done that better. Here's the other piece I want to put in this number 2 category about, I just got to get through this. They're going to push boundaries. That is part of the developmental process. Here's, again, I want to reframe this for you. Pushing boundaries, if I were to reframe that, is they're letting me know what they're passionate about or what's most important to them, because that's where they're going to push the boundaries on the most, which is good information for me to have. Because sometimes those kind of conversations aren't always happening, because they're having those with their friends and they're not having them with us. But if I know I'm getting a lot of pushback, I know that's important, so I need to store that away. The second piece to that is this. If I have a staff person that's really passionate about something in the workplace, what do? I'm like, go, grow, explore, take that on. I encourage that skill set in an adult in a workplace. What would it look like if I figured out a way to do that for my teenager? Because that's a great character trait to have. And what we often do is squash it, diminish it, you have to live within these. And that rigidity is not helpful for their growth. So thinking about, again, how can I reframe some of this and think, how am I approaching this? What's my mindset? And how does that change how I teach, coach, reflect? So the last myth, moving from dependence to total independence. I don't know that anybody's, well, there are people that are dependent or are independent, but I think most of us, if we're really truthful, we have this interdependence with one another. If we're in community, so whether it's family or it's church or it's at work, most of us have this interdependence with one another. We can't do life as a Lone Ranger very well. And so there's this myth that teenagers, they just want to be totally independent of us. That is not actually true. Their brain is, all of our brains are wired to be connected. And so again, when they're trying to seek some independence from us, it's more about the identity shift of what does Amy look like as an 18-year-old versus what did Amy look like as a 10-year-old in this family unit? And so how can we, again, support that growth? So here is the big premise in the brainstorm work that Dan Siegel does, is he likes to use acronyms, which I'm kind of a fan of because it helps my brain remember things. So he uses the acronym ESSENCE. And so the first ES is emotional spark, then social engagement, novelty, and creative exploration. So his premise is that if we as parents could understand these 4 areas, then we will understand what's going on with our kids, and then we can use practices or tools that help us work with rather than against. So I'm going to walk us through that in the next 30 minutes. We're going to walk through each one, similar format for every one of them, because I wanted everybody to have a snapshot. So emotional spark is just exactly what it is. What's happening in the brain is there are all these emotions, they're getting evoked, they're intense, and they sometimes feel like they're happening 90 miles a minute. The reactivity is there. And what's happening is, again, I said this earlier, the amygdala is just, that fast route is happening over and over and over again. So the upside of this is there's passion, they're filled with energy, they feel super alive. I mean, I don't know about you guys. Again, I'm going to, how many days of the week do you feel super alive? There we go. No one raised their hand. But think about your teenagers. I'm like, if I could just bottle up some of this energy sometimes, I could sell that. They have that. That's the upside to this emotional reactivity, the stimulation that's happening. Here's the downside. Emotions can rule the day. And what seems so simple to us is this big eruption for them. I call it the tsunami. So for us, it's like a little wave. For them, it's whew. And you're like, what just happened? Did I miss part of the story? Because this reaction is not matching the story you're telling me. For them, it is, though, you guys. When we put all these pieces together, when I tell you how important this social piece is, and this devastating thing just happened, and it's blowing up before your eyes, it is real for them in this moment in time. And most of us sitting here can be like, yeah, I remember those days in high school, and they're not that big of a deal. But you've got some perspective because you're looking back. And your brain is more developed. Theirs is still under construction. Here's how we can maximize it. So we can maximize it by teaching them that hand model of the brain. They have to begin to understand emotions are they're happening and they're always going to happen, but I need you to pay attention. I need you to start to clue into this. So we can teach them this kind of language. So in my preschool work, we teach this, we use different words, but we teach this to preschoolers. I mean, we can teach this to elementary kids. So those of you that have mixed-aged families, if you've got some elementary kids, start using these words with them now, so when they get to be a teenager, this gets so much easier. Also, increasing their awareness of emotion. So again, because they're so in the moment, the ability to see there was an emotion tied to what just happened is not always readily accessible for them. So I think of an example of the kid that gets nervous before they go to do something, but they've never named it as having anxiety or being anxious or being nervous. They just think every time I go do this activity, it feels icky. And so part of our work is giving feeling words. Do you know the average, in some of Brene Brown's work she just recently released, the average adult only knows 3 feeling words and can accurately assign them to the situation that they're in? So I'm going to use disappointed as my example. So disappointed is there was something planned or some activity was going to happen, and then it didn't happen. So I'm disappointed. Somebody might say, I'm mad because I didn't get to go to blah, blah, blah. Are you really mad or are you disappointed? That's part of what her research was. So thinking about so we know feeling words, but do we know them well enough to actually use them to describe the situations? So average adult knows 3. I want teenagers leaving high school and going out into the world with 8 or 10. Think how much farther ahead they're going to be in this world. It's important for us to help them. And again, we have to work on that ourselves. If we all only know 3 apiece, we've got to work on that ourselves so that we can help them do that. Here's the other piece I think about is to do that work. So to do this maximizing work means I have to be back here in the upstairs brain. So you've got to help me. You've got to do some of that. You've got to, when I'm not, you got to say, hey, let's talk about that emotional reaction. Let's talk about what was going on for you. Here's what I know was going on in your brain. Situation happened, your big emotional sparks were going on, and you flipped your lid. Let's go back and look at that again. And again, was that a small wave or was that a tsunami wave? I can do that when I'm here with you. Don't do it when they're here because they're still emotional. Wait till again, these conversations can happen 5 minutes later, an hour later, 6 hours later. They're still valuable and should happen. I'm going to give you a specific tool when we get to the end, but just wanted to. All right, social engagement. This is probably the biggest one. So social engagement is all about enhancing our peer connections and creating a sense of belonging. So again, the brain is already hardwired for connection. Happens in infancy. I mean, when we come out of the womb, we're dependent on an adult to meet our basic needs. As we move into this adolescence, this 12 to 24-year range, I'm looking for a place to belong. Here's the upside. Hopefully, I'm going to find supportive relationships. And I talked about this earlier. This is where empathy skills are getting built. I'm going to talk about a pre-downside before. If I am not able to find connections, the concern becomes I'm alone, and I am not a part of a group. And when I'm not a part of a group, sometimes what can happen in the world that we live in is I become a target because I don't have a group. And so when I think about like the balancing act as a parent of how do I help them have peer connections, but still say, hey, you're still part of this family. We want you here. Like, you got to do some stuff with us. Like, it's a dance you're going to do, but how do you find some balance to that so that your child has that chance to have those peer connections so they can have that group, so that they can be safe and not be out there by themselves? So I think that's like the intermediate, like, not a downside, but could be a downside if we can't find ways to guide that. The downside, though, is this. We see an increase for risky behaviors, and we see our kids making choices or decisions that we're like, I did not raise them that way. They lose their morality. Like, they lose that internal compass sometimes of what is right or wrong. So I think back to when I was a teenager. I grew up in a town of about 7,500, and I will tell you, I distinctly had two groups of friends. I was in 4-H, and so I had animals, and I showed animals, and I did all those things, and I had that group of friends. And then I had my group of friends from sports, and those two really didn't mesh at my school. And I remember this. I feel like this was me. In the hallway, both groups are coming, and it's like, who am I going to say hi to first, and who's going to then shrug me off because I didn't? And so when I think about this, I think there were times I did things and made choices that I knew were not right so that the one friend group would include me. And there were times I did it just to be in the other friend group. Like this, and I feel like I turned out okay. So like, they're going to make some choices that were like, what happened to you? This is not what I taught you. This is part of their growth and their development. What's important when they're making those choices is how are we supporting them in the reflection of the choices that they made so that next time they make a different choice, or at least they're pausing and thinking before they make the choice. Like, these are the baby steps. And again, this is why this is 12 to 24-year-olds that our brain is doing all this work. This is not one and dones. Here's the risky behavior stuff. I'm going to do risky behaviors because I want that friend group to include me, to like me. I want a sense of belonging. I'm going to do those things. So our work is we maximize that moral compass and we develop reflective skills. Here's how we do that. We ask a lot of questions and lecture less. Because you guys, if you've done anything when they're little, they know right and wrong. And when we lecture, it's wah, 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 wah. When we do questions and reflection, it's a conversation that, again, is teaching skills that they can use as an adult, but it's also allowing them to be heard. And when they feel heard, guess what? The relationship that you're going to have changes. It's important. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, but allow space for conversation. Ask some reflection skills. When you went out and did X, Y, and Z, did you think about the consequences? And we're going to talk more about that in just a second. But those are great reflection questions. I'm going to give you the answer. They didn't. But it's still good for us to ask that because, again, they're going to have to think about that at some point. The other piece that we can think about during this, like how can we understand this more, is Everything for them has a sense of urgency. It is life or death. And we look at it and we're like, it's not. So you don't have to join in that sense of urgency, but understand that it is there. I remember a time with my son when he was in middle school, like it was life or death whether he got to go do this activity. And I was like, no, we've been gone 4 nights this week. Tonight's a family night at home. You would have thought like it was the end of the world. Well, I'll just walk there. Well, you won't, but again, the sense of urgency for him that he was going to miss out on that peer group, that sense of connection, that feeling of belonging. Now, I could have handled that one better, looking back, because I was like, you're not. What I could have said is, you really want to go hang with them. You really want that time to build relations. Like, I would have said it differently, like not that professionally, but yeah, I get you want to go hang with them right now. Hang time with family can be just as important as hang time with your friends. And you've had 4 nights this week. Again, in the moment, but you know what? I have a kid right now that pretty much monitors himself and I feel like lives a pretty balanced life of outside our house and inside our house. Like he probably has better margin for himself than I have for myself. But I feel like all those experiences, all those little, that's what created the space for him to be able to do that today. But again, acknowledging that sense of urgency for them is helpful for us in the relationship piece. Where are we at? Okay. So novelty is like, this is like the biggest one. I think this is where the whole brain is just getting, because so much is happening. So novelty is all about what is our inner motivation to try new experiences and to explore. So novelty is something new. And again, I'm going to ask you guys this. Like, you want your kid to leave your house someday, right? Yes, you do. You do. So in order to do that, they've got to try some new things to build skills. And we sometimes will stifle that. Again, we're in the protection mode because they're going to sometimes choose to do things that are impulsive or risky. And so how do we find the balance in that? So here's the great thing about novelty is that they're open to change. They're open to exploring new things. Like developmentally, their brain is like, give it to me, give it to me, give it to me. The downside of that is we see impulsivity, and again, addictive behaviors can start to emerge. And here is why. Is because when I'm doing new things, this is true for you right now in this moment. When you're doing new things, you have more dopamine released in your head. And when more dopamine is released in your brain, woo, that's the feel-good feeling. It's like your own little high. And so they're getting that woo, woo, every time they do something new. So when I drive my car a little too fast, guess what? Woo! And we're going, don't drive that fast, slow down. I saw on the Life 360 app, you were going 75 on the interstate. Like that's what, because why? Because I'm using my thinking brain. Their dopamine, their reward center in their brain is just working overtime. Again, developmentally, that is appropriate. Here's why I'm like, athletics, creative arts, music, those are great things because those give them dopamine highs too that are things we're like, these are okay, I'm good with these. The ones we don't like, drugs, alcohol, sex, I could just go down the list. Too much video game time, like all of those things. Like we're like, that's too much. So how do we help them explore in a way that they can get those dopamine hits so that we can decrease some of that level of risk? And again, I think it's about how do we help them engage in activities that they find new and exciting? And how do we do that over time rather than giving it to them all at once so that creativeness can be engaged? The other piece to think about is the reason that there's an increase in impulsivity is because here's how impulse control works. Something happens. I pause. I'm like, decide what I'm going to do, and then I do it. Like, that's the definition of impulse control. What did I tell you early on when I was giving you the basic brain stuff? A teenage brain is wired for the fast route. The fast route is never going to exercise impulse control. We're exercising impulse control because we're using cortical thinking, reasoning, and that's part of that process. That is not their go-to. So thinking about, like, we're going to see that. And again, it's going to be different. It's going to present in different ways for different kids. I want to spend just a minute talking about hyper-rationality, because I kind of had forgotten about this until I was preparing this for you guys, and I was like, like this happens so frequently, and we should all know it and talk about it more. So here's the other piece that's happening, again, because of the remodeling that's happening in the brain, and I want to be a part of this social group, and we can just, I'm emotionally reactive. So hyper-rationality is this. It is when I downplay the cons because I'm leaning in towards a positive bias. So when a situation presents itself, like, did you think it was smart to drive 100 miles an hour down that road? Their response is going to be all the positives. Our response is going to be what? You could have died. You could have hurt someone else. You could have wrecked your car. Like, we're in the negatives. We're talking about all the cons. And they're going to lean towards the positives because their brain is wired at the time for hyper-rationality. I'm going to lean into the positives. Those negative things hardly ever happen. And they believe that. Like, so when they're giving us this rationale, we're like, no, this is not. But it is for them. And so again, what do we do with that? We develop the skills for how do we assess the level of risk. So again, this is back to reflection questions. Like, when you learn that they've done some things, what kind of, can you ask some reflective questions? And again, I literally just had this conversation 2 weeks ago when I was looking at this again with my son. I was like, I've been thinking about some things we've talked about lately, and I think this is what was happening. I mean, he's calm. We're just having a regular conversation at dinner. And I just described this. I'm like, I realize that teenage brains tend to lean towards the positives and don't give as much meaning to the negatives. And so that makes it hard for you sometimes to make decisions that that seem like good judgment. So again, talking through some of that is so important because they need to think about that. Like, they're going to lean towards making the not-so-safe choices. The other piece is, how do we help them understand the reward circuitry in their brain? Like, how do we help them understand that they're getting dopamine hits, and that's why it seems so cool and so fun, and that's why they're going to do it over and over and over? And for me, that's a great conversation to have as well around drug use, because that's the other reason why drug use, that's the addictive side of that, is the high that gets created feels good, and the brain seeks it over and over and over again. So how can I give you those dopamine hits in healthy ways? What next musical experience do you need to have to feel challenged, to feel like you're doing something new? Same thing for sports or arts or running or whatever that might be. When I also think about this novelty piece, the other piece that comes to mind is we, again, as adults, are looking for people. If we're in the work setting or we're working on projects or we're doing volunteer work, we're looking for people that have motivation. And so what happens if we begin to try and help figure out how do we do this in a healthy way so that then they continue to be motivated as adults? Because some of us as adults are not as motivated because our motivation got stifled over and over and over again because we didn't explore it in healthy ways. And people kept saying, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. And so I always like to kind of again, how can we do this in a healthy way? All right. Creative exploration. This is a fun one. Again, this is where innovation happens, creation of new ideas. Teenagers, young adults tend to question the status quo. They don't know any different yet. No one's told them they can't do that yet. So when I think about this is where, young people have great ideas that, again, how do we help foster that versus stifling that? And so it gives energy. The upside is, too, there's this outside-the-box thinking, because, again, in their minds, why can't we do that? Why can't that happen? So my best example of this, when I was a youth director, I was in graduate school, and I started off as volunteering, and the next thing I know, I was in charge. So I was youth director of this youth group, and I had this group of amazing instrumentalists and vocalists, and they wanted to have a band. I was like, great, have a band, sounds great. And so they were like, yeah, we're going to practice, and we want to play at youth group stuff. And I was like, great, do that. So the next thing I know, a few Sundays later, I show up at church. They're in the church building by themselves, group high school kids, just jamming, doing their thing. And I walk in, I'm like, what are you guys doing? They're like, having youth band practice. I'm like, how'd you get in here? They're like, oh, the music director came up and opened the doors and just let us in. I'm like, well, where is he? They're like, oh, he left. And I go, I just want to be clear. He came up, let you in, and then he left, and you're all in here using this nice equipment, using the soundboard. They're like, yeah. You guys, I hadn't read this book then, but I'm in that moment, I'm like, okay, Amy, this is great. Look at what they're doing. They came to you with this idea, and you were like, yeah, go for it. I didn't have any conversation about what does this look like. And then I, again, have this amazing, artsy, lovable guy that's the music director. But that's what he does. He didn't think about, oh my gosh, we have 8 teenagers in the building. What happens if something blows up? And the church at the time, we were on the highway. People came in all the time asking for money. And I'm like, what happens if somebody comes in off the highway? This, again, where's my brain? All the risk, all the danger, they're just jamming, having a good time. So then next, I was part-time, so whenever the next staff meeting was, I think in my words I'm like, we need to have a few boundaries with this, so we're going to have to talk about this, but you guys can keep practicing tonight, blah, blah. So get to the next meeting, and I look at the music director, I'm like, what are you doing letting them in the building by themselves? He was like, what do you mean? And the pastor's like, what happened? I'm like, 8 teenagers were in the building, unsupervised, using all the equipment, jamming out. And he goes, somebody needs to be here to supervise them. I'm like, thank you. So we had a compromise. We figured it out. But here's the deal. We totally could have shut that down and stifled that. And what would have happened? That could have changed. Here's the deal. One of them now is a music director at a church. That's his love. Had we played that differently? I think all the time, gosh, if we hadn't encouraged that, who knows what he'd be doing right now? So how do we do that? I think, how do we explore with them, and we can support that? And again, none of their parents were involved. It was all these other adults in their lives that were promoting that. And again, that teaches them another skill. People see you, people value you, you have something to offer. When we don't support creative exploration, there's this lack of direction, there's discouragement, and kids will be vulnerable to peer pressure. So how are we supporting that? So I love supporting exploration with their peer groups for creative outlets and innovation. We can do that. We can find ways to do that. And again, they're getting lots of good dopamine hits whenever that's happening, which is the positive dopamine. So in the few minutes we have left, what are a couple tools? Besides using those maximizing kind of ideas, I wanted to give you 2 specific tools. This one sometimes is hard for people. I've taught this for years in therapy sessions with teenagers, and they use it, and it works. So that's why it was my go-to for tonight. So it is important for us, again, you can use this as an adult, you don't have to be a teenager, for us to sense what is happening inside of us. If we want to be connected with the outside world, we have to first connect with ourselves. And so when I can understand what's happening in my body, then I can have reflection, I can have empathy, and those are the skills that we need to be successful adults. So SIFT is the acronym, and so SIFT stands for 4 things. And what happens is you walk yourself through these, and the SIFT will help you with the C that's inside of you. So again, the river that's running inside of you. How do we find that integration versus being on the banks of the river looking in? So the S is for sensation. So our body gives us so much information if we would pay attention to it. So my easy example is always to use, what are some things that happen in your body when you feel nervous? You get tense, your muscles do this. What did you say? Start sweating. Yes. Feel sick. Stomach hurts. What else? So tapping legs, tapping fingers. Some people talk about, I get headaches. All of those things start to happen. So we just talked through that. Every experience, every emotion you have, your body gives you sensations that gives you information about those feelings. We just don't notice them. Most of us notice the nervousness one, but we don't notice some of the other ones. So sensations about, what do I notice in my body? What's happening in my body? Am I feeling icky in my stomach? Do I feel tense in my shoulders? Am I noticing that my foot's tapping? So it's just this internal check of, what's my body? What am I sensing? The second one is images. So what are there images popping into your head? And again, if we don't do this, what he calls the mind sight, so how do we integrate kind of our mind and have some sight into that? We don't notice this, but after practicing this for some time, there are certain situations that happen that images just kind of, it's real quick, but they pop up. And so notice those. They probably are giving you information. Feelings. So let's name the feelings that you're having. And the last one are your thoughts. What thoughts are running through your head about whatever has happened? So this SIFT tool, when I used to give this out to teenagers, I would walk them through it. I would take some example they had given me that had happened in the last week, and I'm like, let's walk through that. Let's go back to that moment in time. What do you think? Did you feel anything in your body? Did you notice anything? What images? And sometimes they struggle with that because it's a week later. But then the feelings and the thoughts they could almost always do. And so then it's okay, so the next time that happens, I want you to do this. Because when you can sift the sea inside of you, you can find integration. When you're not aware of what's happening inside of you, it is very hard to find that harmony. It is very hard to have healthy choices. For me, this is that mix of, how do I know what's going on inside of me so that I can then relate to the people around me. So this is the me, we. I got to know what about me before I can be with the we. But we don't do that very often. So great tool, great skill. The last one that I said I would give you, because this is about emotional reactivity, because this is what we all face every day, all day, is the name it to tame it. So there's research, again, there's brain scans out there that has been able to demonstrate that if I'm shown an image, a feeling gets evoked inside of me, and there's centers of my brain that get activated. And they are lighting up on the monitor. When the same situation happens and I can then name it, I feel angry when somebody cuts me off in traffic. When I can do that, the imaging, the areas that light up start to decrease the moment I give it a name. So when we are able to name the feeling, we are decreasing the intensity of the emotion. This is why this is important for us to help build emotional vocabularies for our children so that when they're teenagers, they can use them, but we can also do them. You seem angry, you seem frustrated. We can feed them that, which is, here's what we're going to hear. You seem angry. Yeah, I'm angry. Okay, that's great. All right, now you've said it. We're good. Let's tell me what happened. Telling the story that goes with the feeling does the integration right to left. Remember when I said the language box is on the left and the emotion box is on the right? When we can name the feeling and tell the story, we get integration. That provides balance and harmony. So we want to be able to help storytelling with feelings. Here's the deal, too, I talk about with kids. They may not always get the feeling word right. It's about the process, the feeling word with the storytelling. And as they get older, you help with make sure the feeling word matches the situation. You don't have to worry about that when they're younger. Like, don't worry, like, that's not what you felt. Don't do that. Like, that's going to dismiss the feeling. Kind of roll with it, but then when they're teenagers, they're going to have some accurate feeling words to name the situations that are happening for them. And again, if you're still coaching them on this, you're going to do this later, not always in the moment. You can say, you seem angry, what happened? Especially because it's probably happened with their social group. Like, sometimes you're not a part of whatever their emotional reactivity is. You're getting it, but you weren't a part of it. So being able to have those conversations in the moment or later, depending on, you know your teenager best and about that processing piece. There's a wealth of tools in this book, and we've talked about maybe having more workshops in the future, which I would be all about tools, but tonight really was about, like, how do we understand what's going on in that brain? And here are a couple of tools, and also just some good questions about how to maximize the relationships you have and how to utilize that. So, let me see what I put on my, I do have it. I did, for anybody, it's kind of hard to see. You can't really see I put the hyperlinks in there. I did put a hyperlink in there for Dan Siegel's model of the brain, because I tell you, I watch that video all the time just because I love to hear it, and it's always good, and he's always changing it, so you can always Google or go to YouTube and put Dr. Dan Siegel in the hand model of the brain, and you'll get a bunch of hits, because he's always changing that perspective. But I think I'm going to go back to what I started with tonight. I feel like our greatest job as a parent, and why parenting is so hard, is how do I create structure so that I can empower my child to go out and, again, assess the level of risk, try and use the internal moral compass that he has. All of those pieces is my goal, and I can do that through some teaching and coaching if I stay here, if I can use my thinking brain. When I join my teenager in that emotional state, there isn't much teaching and coaching happening. So I think our greatest job is, how do we stay calm? How do we know we have plenty of opportunities to teach, because they're going to give them to us? And how can I begin to use each one in that moment to teach a little something, so that when they get bigger and they leave our houses, they leave our nests. For anybody that needs that class, that's upstairs, right? The empty nest class is upstairs. How do I prepare for that? And the work you do right now is going to prepare them for that and prepare you for that. So thank you. Again, I love this stuff. Could talk about it all day.